The early season schedule is rough for the Jets. Aaron's never played behind a mediocre offensive line. One of the things New England and the Packers have done is establish consistent top 10 O-lines without drafting offensive linemen in the first round. So, I mean, he's had pro bowlers all over the O-line. So this O-line is Elijah Vera Tucker, major questions at both tackles, I believe a rookie center, not a ton of depth. I think it's a little bit of an undoing for, this is going to be first defensive coach for Aaron Rodgers, first suboptimal O-line, really tough division, and a harsh city that's not terribly forgiving. What is a realistic expectation for the Jets nation, for the people you talk to? When you write a column, the reaction. It's easy for me to just say, I think it's a 9-win team. The division's probably the best in football. What say you and a New Yorker who's a Jets fan? What is realistic that will satisfy them at year end? Take a Super Bowl out.
I'll say 10-7, make the wild card, finish second behind Buffalo, and win a wild card round game, and then lose in the divisional round at Kansas City, at Cincinnati, get whacked in that second playoff game. But I think that's the problem is, look at that schedule. I mean, the first 10 games, they could be 3-7 and not be playing that poorly. So they're playing both Super Bowl teams, right? Philly and Kansas City. They're in that division. They're starting against Buffalo, but at home. So that's a game they really almost have to win if you look at the first 10 games. So I think the formula for success, at least the way I define it, is go 4-6 in those first 10 games, and then They're winnable games. Those final 7, they can go maybe 5-2, 6-1, sneak into the playoffs as a wild card, win a game, and then face the end in the divisional round at Kansas City. So I think that's a successful season. And then enter year 2 of Aaron Rodgers as one of the Super Bowl favorites to get out of the AFC. I think that is at least somewhat realistic, but maybe too optimistic, perhaps, in talking to some Jets fans who are used to, I always say this, they hate when I say it, the Jets have not reached the Super Bowl, never mind win one, since man stepped on the moon. That was a long time ago. So they're wired to feel the worst is going to happen. But I'm going to be pretty optimistic, and I'll say 10-7 and make the playoffs.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting because the Packers furnished him with very good protection and 2 offensive coaches. Say what you will about Mike McCarthy. We're seeing this in New England with Belichick, who's virtually tone deaf to offense, made a DC the OC, can't draft skill players to save his life. Even the best defensive coaches, they don't talk the same language. So this is Aaron's, and Nathaniel Hackett's coming off a bruising, ugly performance in Denver. So I do feel the pressure is really on Aaron to run the offense. And he's okay at that, but he can also be a little aloof and a little disengaged at times. Here's the thing that I've noticed about Aaron, that I don't think he's a bad guy. He can be a little bit of a finger pointer, a little passive aggressive. When things go south, New York is going to force you to answer tough questions. A Green Bay Midwestern media, Ian, is just not the same. Like you drive, I can remember driving to work when I was at ESPN, and I would turn on New York radio, and it would set the tone for the discussion of the week. Like, it's a tone setter. And I think you can kind of roll your eyes if you're Aaron Rodgers at the small market, Green Bay, relax. You go relax to New Yorkers, that's not going to play. Like, they don't relax. What they're known for is intensity. How do you think the Aaron media thing will play out?
Well, so far, it's been a really good marriage. I think he came in wanting to make the best possible impression on the New York market, the fans and the media. I think the New York media thing is a little bit of a myth since I've been in it for 37 years, in that I think there's just more of us. We probably judge it a little more harshly than every other market outside of Philly and Boston. But I don't think the New York media is unfair. It's large and it's tough, but not unfair. So he's got an opportunity here. I think if he ever won a championship, what would that do for his legacy? I mean, you have Tom Brady sitting there on the top of the mountain with 7 rings and Aaron's at 1. If you want to close that legacy gap, to win a Super Bowl for the New York Jets would go a long way towards doing that. And so I think Rodgers, he may have been disengaged in Green Bay, particularly at the end. He has occasionally pointed fingers in a passive aggressive way, but he hasn't been that figure so far in New York at all. I went out to all the open OTAs, and by all accounts, talking to players, coaches, executives, he has been fully engaged in meeting rooms and practices and just watching him. He's constantly talking to receivers, the tight ends, offensive linemen. Hey, do this. Let's talk about that cut you just made coming out of your route. I kind of like you to do it this way. There's been a ton of that. So far, it's early, obviously. We haven't started training camp yet. He has been a very, very good leader on and off the field by all accounts. Let's see if it holds up, and let's see how that translates on the field in September when they play for real. But as much as people have talked about what an all-time great quarterback can do for this hapless franchise, I think there's a lot the New York Jets can do for Aaron Rodgers. Like I just said, if he somehow can win one in the 2 or 3 years that he plays here in New York and gets ring number 2, it's going to feel like he won 4 rings. It's almost like what Messier did coming to New York in 94, even though he had won 5 in Edmonton. He wins a cup, ends a 54-year drought. And the one cup people talk about when they talk about his legacy is the one he won for the Rangers in New York. And he'll tell you that too. So I think that's the kind of opportunity that Rodgers has. Let's see how it plays out.
There's the book behind you, Belichick. It's a great book. I highly recommend to our audience. I had Ian on for the Coach K book. I thought it's just the definitive book on Coach K and the Duke program, captain with Derek Jeter and Belichick. And Belichick, if you go look at the history of sports, there'll be cultural changes in all of them. We've seen it with baseball analytics. It used to be the strikeout. Dave Kingman was almost like a cartoonish. Today he'd be Cody Bellinger, right? Home run or strikeout. It's not as punitive, right? Like analytics have changed. And in football, it's not as analytically driven as basketball. NBA, the three-point shot, small ball. Although I do think we're pivoting back to international bigs and highly skilled bigs. But in the NFL, it's more of an offensive league, mostly because of that nearly $1 billion check they wrote for CTE, head injuries. This league is all about offense. It's good for ratings, it's good for fantasy, and it's good for lawsuits. Like, don't be too, there's already a regulated level of violence. And so if you look at the remaining coaches the last several years, they're all offensive. I think it was 2 years ago, every NFC playoff team had an offensive coach. Belichick has looked particularly tone deaf dealing with Mac Jones. And that whole culture. I'm going to throw a theory at you and shoot holes in it. But Belichick largely ran the Patriots dynasty. Robert Kraft hands off. Brady was never subversive, ever. It was Bill's team. In fact, later he complained about not having a say in the offense. And so Brady eventually leaves because he just doesn't get control. Even though there was a moment, Tom goes to Kraft, they sell off Garoppolo. And it was the one time Belichick was not running the show. So Mac Jones comes in. McEnroe Jones, a little bit of an ego, a little bit of an attitude. And it feels like Bill is really punishing him and marginalizing him. They re-signed Devontae Parker, Juju Smith-Schuster. Those are players that need coaching and schemes to get open. They do not separate. They have no tight end or receiver that is an ad-libber, a playmaker, maybe the slowest team in the perimeter in the league. And what it does, it drives the organization once again back through Bill. Run game, defense. I'm not going to create a quarterback who is so powerful that can go through the owner. And maybe I'm reaching on this, but I'm watching their moves. They make no sense. They drafted 3 guards and 2 kickers. First 3 picks were defense. They're the slowest offense in the league. Doesn't it strike you odd over the last 2 drafts, 2 years, the lack of, in a cultural shift, the lack of offensive awareness? Am I missing something?
No, I think it has been very surprising. And Bill's history, though, if you look at how many Hall of Famers, true Hall of Famers, did Tom Brady ever play with? Randy Moss, they didn't win a championship together. That didn't last long. And of course, Gronk. Outside of that, in terms of weapons, Brady was elevating a whole lot of people out there. And Mac Jones, he's not Tom Brady. He has a chance maybe to win a championship or two. This is such a huge year for him now that he has a real offensive coordinator again in Bill O'Brien. And Belichick has never really been big on drafting weapons and running a high-powered offense, even though in 2007, when they brought in Randy Moss and Wes Welker was at the height of his powers too, that offense was a complete juggernaut and shattered all kinds of records. And in my book, I gave Bill credit for being a defensive genius, probably the best defensive coach of all time, and suddenly shifting and with help from his staff, of course, but turning that slot position into such a weapon, which then everybody tried to copy. And then later going with the two tight ends with Gronk and Hernandez. And so he became a bit of an innovator on offense, but you're right. And I think Brady would complain privately to people about, where are my weapons? He did have Randy Moss, maybe the greatest receiver of all time, for a little while. They didn't win one together. They should have. But outside of that and Gronk at tight end, he's been doing or did do a ton of elevating of people who were pretty good to good football players, but not great players at the skill position slots. So I think, and on one hand, it's a bit surprising. On the other hand, when has he done it? He just had a much better quarterback than he has right now.
I want to talk Giants. I had this rant a couple of weeks ago, and I said, we've always known how great Peyton Manning is, but because of his greatness, we never quite gave Eli Manning his just desserts. His two greatest passes in the Super Bowl as he beat Brady and Belichick were to Mario Manningham and David Tyree. Plaxico and him had some good days, but he did it with a defensive line, a little bit of a rigid head coach. He didn't have great offensive lines. And I said, if you take Eli's prime of 12 years out, what have the Giants been in 20 years? Is that because of Peyton's greatness and kind of flamboyant, funny personality, Eli's much funnier now that he's retired, that are the Giants really well run? They ran through GMs. They've run through coaches that we've never quite said to ourselves, yeah, he won at Ole Miss. He beat Brady Belichick twice. He never had great receiving cores. I'll ask you, take out Eli's 12 prime years. It's an abysmal record. Are the Giants well run?
Well, I said this before, but John Mara was a good owner when he had a good head coach and a good quarterback. And that was Tom Coughlin and Eli Manning. When he didn't, he was a bad owner. And that lasted a while. And now he's got a GM in place in Joe Shane, a head coach in Dable, and maybe a quarterback in Daniel Jones who know what they're doing. So he's back to being a pretty good owner again. But he was a bad owner for a while. There's no question. It was making bad hires, Gettleman, and some of the coaches that were brought in, Pat Shurmur. I mean, that never made any sense to hire that guy. And so finally, I think they got it right. And they've had some dark periods, of course, in their history, the Giants have, followed by some tremendous periods with Parcells and then with Coughlin. And really, if you look at it, in that Coughlin Eli era that you're talking about, their best team, they really should have won 3 titles. Their best team was the 2008 team. If Plaxico doesn't accidentally shoot himself, Coughlin told me they thought they were winning the whole thing. That was the only dominant Giants team. They were 11-0 that year. And then all hell broke loose after the Plaxico accidental shooting. So they could have won 3 titles and they blew it. And so never got that one back. But yes, you could certainly argue the Giants were a poorly run franchise. If you take, you're taking away a lot, though. That's a lot of years there that Eli was a good. I don't think Eli was ever a great or one of the best 3 quarterbacks in the NFL in any particular season, but he was very opportunistic. and he was good. And then he was great in the biggest moments against the greatest coach and greatest quarterback of all time. And that'll probably get him in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I always felt he had a unique ability. You know, they talked about when he was a kid, nothing bothered him. Whereas whereas Peyton Manning was known as a bit of a teeth clencher in big moments. Really intense. People I know who know Peyton, very, very intense. I've done a couple interviews where I've had Peyton and Eli together, and Eli's always like late, and Peyton's dogging him, and Eli's laughing. Eli it's not aloof because he has no arrogance. Eli I love the guy. He reminds me a little bit of my son. Everything rolls off his back. Nothing is outrageous. He's just, and I think some of that, Ian, I don't know if you have relationships like this, that his brother was so intense. Maybe it's the curry favor with dad and mom. He was the funny guy, right? Like in the family. And so I always thought Eli's personality, it was so unique. You know, Brady's so focused and Russell Wilson's so focused. And it's like Eli's like this kind of country, smart, funny. Pressure doesn't faze him. I remember early in his career thinking, this guy's one of the best 2-minute quarterbacks. It was literally like, can we just keep him in the 2-minute drill? The rest of the game, I have my apprehension. Right. What was he like to cover?
Interesting. And so he's, as you said, he's shown more of his personality in retirement than he did as an active player, but he was accountable and always there. And he had a little rule. If we win, I'm not talking on Mondays. He had his usual day of Wednesdays when he talked before the next game. If we lose, I'll talk on Mondays because I want to take my fair share of the blame. And when the Giants won on Sunday, he wanted to make sure other teammates had their moment in the sun on Monday with the media and didn't want to detract from that. I remember one time they were playing the Patriots in the regular season. He had already beaten the Patriots in the Super Bowl once, if not twice. And it was a Monday and they were coming off a win. And I went to the Giants PR people and I said, hey, you guys are playing the Patriots. It's Eli. I know you won yesterday and he wants his teammates to get the credit. He needs to talk today, even if it's just for 6 minutes. So one of the PR reps walked over to Eli, whispered to him. I saw him nod his head and he understood. He got it. He realized that was one day he needed to make an exception because it was the New England Patriots that they were playing the following Sunday. And he did it. Eli always did the right thing. And that was the right thing. It's a little window into his soul. But I had conversations, many with Archie, about the difference between Peyton and Eli. And Archie said, could you imagine if Peyton ever played in New York? He said the media and Peyton would have been at each other's throats in week 1 of his rookie year. He said it would have been a disaster, Peyton in New York. So he said, thankfully, that never happened. Eli was the perfect personality for New York because, like you said, he let everything roll off his back. I remember one time Archie told me that it was a day where Tiki Barber just ripped Coughlin in the media. And Archie called up Eli on the phone and realizing Eli didn't care, was oblivious. And Eli was heading to the facility, but the call went to voicemail. And Archie said, Eli, you have to know this. Tiki just blew up Coughlin. When you arrive at work, they're going to ask you about it. You need to know about this. So he said that's how Eli was. Like he wouldn't have cared. I'm sure if he walked in there, he would have handled the questions the way he always did. And he said, but there were certain times where it was maddening. I needed to call my own son and say, you have to understand, this is New York. Tiki just blew up Coughlin. You have to answer this. Be prepared. So I always got a kick out of those Archie stories.
Well, you know, New York has an interesting history. If you come in as a non-star and develop into one, Judge, Jeter, Eli, Phil Simms, it always works. When you come in, even as a college player, as a star, Giancarlo Stanton, A-Rod, Carmelo Anthony, I'm probably missing. Jeremy Shockey was going to be a star player. There's something about it in New York. Maybe it's the expectations of New York. Like they hold you. Most of the great iconic New Yorkers, and I wasn't around during the Mantle era. If you come in and develop into one, there's just an appreciation by New Yorkers. I always think, I think NBA guys know this. Like not a lot of free agents. That's why Jalen Brunson's such a perfect Nick. He's becoming a star in New York. That's exactly how to do it. When you bring in Marbury, it doesn't work. It doesn't feel the same. By the way,
the one time it did was Reggie Jackson. I know we're going back almost 50 years, but he was a star and he wanted to be a bigger star. It worked to the tune of 2 championships. Now, it was a pretty ugly ending. But Reggie was one guy who came in as a star. It was combustible, but it worked. And the relationship with Thurman Munson, and they were complete opposites. And at times it got really tense in that clubhouse. Obviously, I wasn't there. I was 13 years old, but reading all the accounts, but Reggie became an even bigger star and just thrived on that spotlight and all the tension around that team.